those who never got to the American shore. That was the magnitude of loss, and that is part of the real history of African Americans. It's not fiction. In order to get a hint of the terror of that situation, you have to imagine yourself actually in that predicament. This loss, oh, this is my reminder to tell Elijah to get my Southwest boarding pass, because I don't want to be in the C section, if y'all know about the, y'all know about that. So Elijah, you got it. So take care of it. All right, that's important. when you travel, you do not want to be in the sea. I'm sorry, you're gonna edit this out, right? Okay, so let's move on. All right, so that's what actually happened. The nightmare of being a part of the cargo of people and actually living through an experience wherein tens of millions died on the trip. This is the way in which African Americans began their experience of centuries of chattel slavery in America. After being kidnapped and cruelly shipped to a foreign land, the human dismantling continued. The African slaves that were stripped of their names, their languages, their cultures, their traditions, their religions, their histories, and even the memories of their past. According to Imam Muhammad, they were subjected to an experimental clinic designed to cause them to dysfunction in the vital areas of their lives. Consequently, any African that survived this voyage of horrors and was thrown onto this land was immediately brought into this process designed to dismantle them as a human being. The most enduring impact of slavery on the African American psyche was that it produced self-hatred in the African Americans. The African American people have been through unprecedented agony and trauma. They have been lynched with impunity. They have been isolated. They have been segregated. They have been alienated. They have been marginalized. They have been stigmatized. They have been disenfranchised in every quarter of American society and in the world. Those who are of other ethnic extractions need to only imagine one person being in that depressive situation to imagine the manner in which these millions of slaves spent their days and nights. How much had they implored Allah, God? How pleadingly did they call out, "Oh Allah, please help me. Oh Allah, where are you? Didn't you see what's happening to me? Don't you see what's happening to me?" How can anyone, I'm saying now, how can anyone imagine that the merciful creator of the heavens and the earth would allow such pleas from millions of human beings to go on for centuries and do nothing? If you can imagine that, then you don't really believe in God by the name Allah or any other name. Footprints in the Sand is a beautiful story which well illustrates the providential state of affairs for African Americans and anyone in dire need of the help of God. It depicts how Allah is always near and how Allah is never absent at any time or place. It goes like this. One night a man had a dream. He dreamed he was walking along the beach with the Lord. Across the colorful sky flashed scenes from his life. For each scene he noticed two sets of footprints. One belonged to him and the other to the Lord. When the last scene of his life was flashed before him, he looked back at the footprints and noticed that many times along the path of his life, there was only one set of footprints. He also noticed that it happened at the very lowest and saddest times of his life. This really bothered him, and he questioned the Lord about it. "Lord, you said that once I decided to believe in you, you would walk with me all the way. But I have noticed that during the most troublesome time of my life, there was only one set of footprints. I don't understand why. When I needed you the most, you would abandon me." The Lord said to him, "My precious, precious child, I love you, and I would never leave you. During your time of trials and tribulation, when you see only one set of footprints, it was then that I was carrying you." This little story describes the life and faith of African Americans in the United States. There have been many low points and low times in our lives when it seemed as though we were all alone. Now we have come to realize that Allah has actually been carrying us continually. Allah did answer those cries of the slave, and Allah was never absent at any time or place. The souls of black folks speak. Anyone who studies African American history with the consciousness of Allah's way will recognize some 300 years after this agonizing and traumatic experience began, the longings of the African American soul began to speak with a human voice. A human voice. Not an African voice, not a tribal voice, not a slave voice, not a Negro voice, a human voice. It was the voice of the soul created by Allah, the voice of the soul that knows that Allah is. That human soul found eloquent expression in such persons as Frederick Douglass, Martin Delany, Denmark Vesey, Harriet Tubman. As time marched on, more and more voices speaking for the human soul of black folks were added to the chorus of freedom. David Walker, Sojourner Truth, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, Noble Drew Ali, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and Elijah Muhammad, and many, many others. All these voices began to ring and reverberate in the 19th and the early mid-20th century, loudly in the world and among African Americans. It is through giants like these and others that what was lost was in principle regained. African American people began to see literacy and education spread. Political enfranchisement came to these people. African Americans began to gain more political offices, influence, and power. African Americans began to see respect for their race and ethnicity grow in America and the world. African American people began to reclaim their African names. Even though they didn't know where on the African continent they came from, they began to reclaim any culture or traditions that were of apparent African origin. They began again to respect and love the continent of Africa. Organizations like the United Negro Improvement Association, the Nation of Islam, and individuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Coffey did give us some direction back to African appreciation. What is of great significance is that this entire awakening has occurred without any invasion or any infusion of resources from Africa to the African American people. Marcus Garvey tried to get ships together to go back to Africa, not conversely. The repatriation movement tried to get us back to Africa, not vice versa. Some Christian missionaries tried to get us to go back to Africa. However, there were no African missionaries saying, let's go over to America and get our lost brothers and sisters. Nobody. There was no movement you could point to on the African continent in all those centuries of slavery that said we need to go back and get our stolen brothers and sisters. Not one. But we can point to back to Africa movements over here. The message is that as far as the world was concerned, we have been on our own. Professor Farad's Nation of Islam, a stranger with a strange ingredient. In 1930, a significant catalyst in the person of Professor W.D. Farad joined the challenge to lift this ponderous burden by amalgamating what were the most effective methodologies for positive transformation of the lives of those then so-called American Negroes from the Black Freedom Movement. W.D. Farad created a unique strategy for the amelioration of the psychological circumstances being suffered by African Americans at the time. The psychological culture of the Nation of Islam of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad's day inculcated a protective and assertive disposition in its members, so much so that through its interpretation and elaboration by Imam W.D. Muhammad, one can never capture them and enslave its adherents in any way again, even in the name of Islam. I have a typo here. I need to be real clear on what I'm saying. It says, meaning now, if someone tried to capture us now, we can never be enslaved again, even in the name of Islam. Nobody can come to this people and seek to make a slave out of it. There's not a trick in your bag that's going to work on the one who took, let's call it the right pill from the Imam, right? Inshallah. All right, let's get back to the note. So some African American Muslims went through that Nation of Islam experience, which Imam Muhammad said was another metaphysical maze designed after the other metaphysical maze. It was one experimental clinic replacing another experimental clinic. The Imam said that Farad had structured the Nation of Islam as a mystical maze whose only way out was the moral route. It was Imam Muhammad's conviction that the members of the Nation of Islam were going to be locked in that maze until someone solved the puzzle and mastered the maze. Make sure I'm in the right place. Okay. Indeed, Imam Muhammad, then known as Wallace D. Muhammad, had been out of that maze for some time when Malcolm began his exit on moral grounds. In his autobiography, Malcolm wrote of his conversion from the Nation of Islam doctrine to true Islam. He wrote in his book, autobiography, he said, "All through the night I copied similar long letters from others who were very close to me. Among them was Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace Muhammad, who had expressed to me his conviction that the only possible salvation for the Nation of Islam would be its accepting and projecting a better understanding of Orthodox Islam," end quote. Whoever could solve Professor Farad's puzzle would be the one to free them from the maze. Who solved it? Imam W.D. Muhammad. Love it, hate it, or be indifferent to it, no serious intent to understand Imam Muhammad could be realized without understanding how his work relates to that of Farad Muhammad. He was known by several different names, Elijah Muhammad, and the Nation of Islam. There is an unbreakable linkage between the mission of Imam Muhammad, Professor W.D. Farad, and Elijah Muhammad. Furthermore, any interest in attaining an unprejudiced comprehension of the work of Professor W.D. Farad in relationship to the African Americans' historic dilemma in the United States requires an apprehension of the fact that Professor W.D. Farad appended his work to the historic and ongoing Black freedom movement and hybridized it. I hope there ain't too many college words for you in there, right? He hybridized it with Islamic elements, particularly its terminology. Terms like Muslim, Allah, Muhammad, Quran, Islam, the Islamic greetings of Assalamu alaikum, Mecca, Ramadan, and actually not much more than that. During an Imam's Ramadan session, Imam Muhammad rahimahullah alayhi, he spoke of how Professor W.D. Farad connected the Black freedom movement and Islam. The Imam says, quote, "Don't think we can separate as African American Muslims from what has happened to our people any more than Moses and the followers of Moses can separate themselves from their people. All of their people weren't with Moses, but they're all put together, aren't they? That's because the circumstances for that happening must be seen as the full picture. When Professor Farad came, there wasn't any family of Elijah Muhammad, no temple of Islam. There was just the African American people. So he came because he saw the African American people, and then he set something up to motivate the African American people, to motivate them out of their circumstances and to better their circumstances," end quote. A facet of the uniqueness that Professor W.D. Farad brought to the Black freedom movement was that, as Imam Muhammad has said, quote, "He came on the bandwagon of others, or he joined the voices of others, the apocalyptic voices of others, and he came with his own language as to why the doom was near or why the end must come or has come. He came with his own language. Mr. W.D. Farad came with his idea of how Armageddon is to be explained, and he came also to show how to deliver the promised relief to the suffering that he chose to limit his works among the Black, the so-called Negro, African American people," end quote. Professor Farad's diagnosis and prescription. According to Imam Muhammad, what Professor Farad did was diagnose the condition of the psychology of the African American and then wrote a prescription intended to reverse those effects. That prescription was the Nation of Islam. Imam Muhammad said, quote, "Farad knew how to reach deep into the psychology, the personality of the African American person, and reach deep into him as a friend and get his confidence and cause that person to just blindly accept anything Farad said. We accepted anything Farad said. We didn't question it. We had no desire. We had no ability to question anything he said because he had convinced us so thoroughly that he was the one to trust and America was the one to distrust. He was right. The white man was wrong. So in the Nation of Islam, W.D. Farad created an environment designed to contain, train, and discipline the African American life to make it new. The Nation of Islam included military drilling so as to cultivate and discipline African Americans by